Everyone, thanks for joining. We'll be starting in just 2 more minutes here. When you join, go ahead and put your org in the chat, your name and your organizational affiliation. Can't wait to get started.
Hey all, we'll go ahead and get started. No kidding, my Windows update just logged me out and is 30% complete. So while that's getting to 100%, Ben, Ryan, Martha, could you all introduce yourselves to everywhere, and then I'll share my slides?
That sounds good. Ben, do you maybe want to start off?
Sure thing. Ben Holland, with RMI, I'm manager on our urban transformation team, work on housing and transportation issues.
And I'm Ryan Warsing. I'm a senior associate also with RMI. Work with the urban transformation team as well, deal in federal funding and land use reform, among other things. Martha.
And I'm Martha Roskowski. I am with Further Strategies. I'm a consultant. I'm here today because I'm helping to coordinate a loose and broad coalition of groups focused on land use reform at a statewide level here in Colorado. Nice to be here today.
Excellent. So thank you all for introducing yourselves. We have a 3-part presentation for you all today, and the last part's interactive, so definitely stick around. We will hear first from Ben and Ryan at RMI about some updates on the latest research in affordable and clean communities. And then we'll kick things over to Martha to learn more about the Colorado case, specifically what advocates are up to and what's being considered in the state legislature. I will also introduce, while that's coming up, the America's All In Coalition. America is All In is hosting today. We are the largest group of subfederal actors. So that's businesses, universities, nonprofits, cities, all joined together after the US withdrew from the Paris Agreement to tackle climate solutions. Today, we are focusing more forward on implementing effective state policy. And to give an example of that, my colleague Jasmine's here today. Jasmine, do you want to talk about some of the related work you're doing in Colorado?
Yeah, definitely. And Miguel, do you want me to share slides? Because I have the PowerPoint in front of me. So Miguel was asking me or requested me to share a little bit about what I'm working on in Colorado. So I support the building decarbonization initiatives, and specifically in Colorado, at the end of this month, the Energy Code Board is going to be developing and voting on an energy code that future-proofs all new buildings and major retrofits in Colorado for building electrification, for solar readiness, and also readiness for EV charging. So in case you're interested in supporting strong requirements for those energy codes, Miguel is going to circulate this presentation after the meeting today, but if you're interested in signing on your organization to voice your support for that, the link is here. But we are interested in pushing for stronger requirements so buildings can be more prepared for electrification coming soon. So Miguel, I'll pass it back to you, or Ryan or Ben.
How's that coming up? You seeing my slides? Great.
Looks great.
Very, very good then. Well, we'll get right into it because I know we want to leave a lot of time for discussion at the end of the presentations today. Ben and I are just presenting a little bit on land use and climate change, what we know, where we can go. Very Dr. Seuss presentation that we have for you today, but that's the only rhyme, I promise. These are our presenters and our email addresses. We'll share these again at the end of the discussion, just in case you have anything that you want to bring up with us, questions, comments, anything at all. And with that, we will get to the bulk of the presentation. So we're here today because RMI has done a lot of analysis in the past couple of years to suggest that the U.S. Is unable to meet its Paris climate ambitions without shifting the amount that we drive and changing where and how we build development. This is just a smattering of relevant research. There's no need to study each one of these individually. We'll be sharing these in the chat. But the big takeaways are that in order to meet our goals, to reach that 1.5 degrees Celsius future that we're trying to get to, the U.S. needs to cut transportation emissions by about 45% in just 7 years by 2030. That's extremely ambitious, but it's achievable. But electrification of our cars isn't the only solution to that. It can't be the only solution. Our research that Ben's going to get into in more detail later on says that even if we electrified 70 million new EVs by 2030, which is a very optimistic goal, we would still need to reduce total vehicle miles traveled by 20% or so. So we'll get into that a little bit more, but that's the big takeaway. Even if we electrified in a really ambitious way, we'd still need to reduce the amount of total driving across the board among all vehicles. So land use reform is a key means of doing that, and land use reform enables housing, and that can have affordability and inclusion consequences as well as climate consequences. So the technological barriers are real for these things, but the primary barriers as we see them are not technological, but rather social and political. And so that's something that maybe Martha will be able to address later on as well. Just to repeat the enormity of the problem, 30% of US greenhouse gases come from driving just by itself. And even with 70 million new EVs, we still need to reduce vehicle miles traveled by 20%. There are many ways that we can go about doing that. We can prioritize smart growth. We can create pricing signals. We can create transportation demand management systems, street redesign, and we can stop the expansion of highways. Of these, my research has found that smart growth is the most impactful. And when we say smart growth, what we mean is reform that locates new housing in places where, by design, people need to travel less to get to jobs and school and other services. So I'll pause there just for a second. That's sort of the fundamental stuff. Is there any questions about anything we've talked about so far? All right. Hearing none, we'll keep going. So our research has been validated by others, most notably the Cool Climate team at University of California, Berkeley. They have shown that urban infill and VMT reduction are often the most effective emissions reduction strategies that are available to local governments. You can see here 2 sets of data, one for Mountain View, California, and one for California as a whole. And among these, you can see the placement of urban infill and VMT reduction ranked with all other kinds of strategies like EV adoption, energy efficiency, and all these other things that cities are really prioritizing right now. So just pause here to show just how much emissions reductions are on the table with these kinds of strategies. It's a lot. And if we want to put it, give a name to the problem is sprawl. Sprawl is bigger houses, more cars, more roads to get to those bigger houses, and more land consumed. Exclusionary land use fuels urban sprawl and locks in higher transportation emissions. Sprawl also consumes the lands that we need to grow food, absorb carbon, and act as a buffer against climate hazards. Put this all in perspective, our research has shown that a single-family home uses about as much electricity and natural gas as a multi-family home in California. Or excuse me, uses twice as much electricity and natural gas as a multi-family home in California. So it's a pretty substantial difference. And between 1992 and 2005, sprawling U.S. urban land expansion destroyed as much forest area as the size of California's Central Valley, and that's both directly and indirectly as a result of cropland displacement. Sprawl is bad and getting worse, and for those of you in Colorado, I don't need to tell you that. It's a particularly pronounced problem in Colorado. Building more multifamily housing and limiting mansionization could avoid 40% of embodied carbon, that's construction materials and emissions. So, there are a lot of direct and indirect emission savings that come from just smart growth and building in a more organized and efficient way. At RMI, we really do believe that housing policy is climate policy, but that there's a lot of questions involved there. What kind of housing? Do we build that housing upward or outward? What areas do we build in and what areas do we leave alone? Land use reform encompasses all of these questions. And if we use land use reform effectively, we've found that we can avoid roughly 200 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent by 2030, which in reality is about the emissions reduction potential of building electrification, which is something that I think we all understand is really important. and a lot of cities have very concrete action plans to achieve. And yet many of these climate action plans do not really include anything about land use and the emissions and resilience impacts of that land use reform. So the reasons for that are many, difficult to quantify. You don't know exactly how the market is going to provide new housing. Just because it's able to be built in a certain place doesn't mean it's market ready. And there are other reasons that we probably don't have time to get into right now. But you can see here that there's some plans that have incorporated these considerations. We've shown them here on this slide, but these tend to be the exception rather than the rule. So this is an underappreciated form of emissions reduction that we hope you come away with that. And the time is really ripe for change. This is sort of how it happens. 50 years of sprawl policies, they just don't end overnight. But there's been a lot of momentum, never been quite so much momentum as there is now for serious land use reform. These coalitions that are working right now have brought us in this cycle almost to the point of new policy in Colorado, and that's why we're here today to talk about what that new policy might look like and what the implications of it might be. That is, I'm pretty sure, where I stop my presentation, but I will pause for just 30 seconds of questions before I turn it over to Ben. All right, well then, Ben, it's all yours, and I'll continue on with the slides.
Great, thanks, Ryan. And I'll just have to say next slide, I guess, to advance after each one. Cool. Can we go to the next one? Actually, yeah. So what we wanted to do here is give you kind of a preview of a report that we're putting out in the first week of April that is really focused on quantifying the impacts, the benefits really of smart growth policies, kind of a number of land use reforms in 3 major American cities, Austin, Texas, Charlotte, North Carolina, and of course, Denver, Colorado. And this report really focuses around these 3 strategies, being upzoning, so really allowing by right development up to a certain level of density of or kind of compactness of housing type. So you can think of duplexes or fourplexes, infill and redevelopment, so activating vacant parcels and underutilized areas, and of course, transit-oriented development, which many people in the Denver area are very familiar with our light rail system and enhanced kind of bus system now. So we focused on these 3 strategies in looking at those 3 cities using a tool called Urban Footprint. And I'll give you kind of a preview of what that analysis looks like in the next slide. So the big kind of takeaways here that we wanted to throw up or kind of put on paper in a sense, really, in addition to emissions reductions, we see, to Ryan's earlier point, a significant potential to reduce vehicle miles traveled, which is, of course, a big part of meeting those climate goals. We went into this report starting with the intent to focus on VMT reduction, but we discovered a lot of other benefits, of course. So if you look at the incremental land savings between 52% and 82%, that's kind of your classic sprawl development versus what we call our alternative land use reform scenarios. Seeing very significant reductions there. Of course, carbon sequestration potential, just because you essentially keeping grasslands, agricultural lands, greenfield, not developing greenfields, I should say, and of course, water consumption, which is very important to us in the Denver area. So yeah, just again, these 3 cities, very significant potential through those strategies. If we want to go to the next slide, I'll kind of give you an idea of what this looks like. Now, of course, this is kind of a theoretical exercise. I should say that the analysis or the maps that you see here, and apologies if they're not super clear, this is a kind of the smaller version of the Denver DRCOG region, where we've assumed a certain level of suburban growth, particularly kind of in the plains areas going out to the airport. So anybody that's familiar, obviously going out to Denver airport, seeing quite a bit of your kind of classic single family development out there. Looking at growth forecasts that DRCOG has published in the past going out to 2040, or 2035, we match those growth forecasts with an alternative scenario that you'll see to the right, where we've put the bulk of that housing along transit corridors and kind of compact destination and transit rich environments. So the result of that being a reduction in BMT of 10% per capita. Now, I should say, this of course would assume some policies that would prevent kind of that further proliferation of suburban development out there in the plains. This is kind of your perfect future scenario where you're seeing much more walkable kind of urbanist developments occurring in those key corridors in our cities in the Denver region. I think we can go to the next slide and give you a bit of a closer to block level perspective. This is West Colfax leading from Denver out to just about Lakewood area. And we specifically mapped underutilized land, vacant land, and kind of industrial properties that were ripe for development. We looked at a little bit of the market economics of the land that we were running these scenarios for. And now this is not to say that this was flip overnight. We're suggesting that we develop all of these properties. This is a significant amount of land here where we quantified the potential for over 24,500 housing units on strip commercial, vacant, and underutilized land. So that would be your kind of classic mid-rise, 3 to 5 story-ish buildings with ground floor retail, mixed use development that we're all pretty familiar with. Understanding that there's a bit of a housing crisis, not just in Denver area, but the other 2 cities we looked at. We wanted to kind of give policymakers a sense of, where could this type of development occur? How could you kind of take a surgical approach to enabling more housing in the areas where it is needed, in addition to looking at policies that will enable wider kind of development of housing throughout the state. So just, again, wanted to give you some quick previews of the report. Again, that'll come out in the first week of April. And we're looking forward to getting some feedback on that. I think that's my last slide before we go over to Martha, but I'll pause there if there are any questions. Apologies, there's a lawnmower that just started up outside my window.
Hey, Ben, when you were, you had the slide of the benefits of different land use. What was your assumption there around density?
We can go back to that slide too, Ryan, if you want to go back, I think maybe it's 3 slides.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's find that.
And thank
you. So we didn't assume any level of, if you look like the Dr. Cog kind of report, we didn't assume a certain number of dwelling units per acre that would be necessary in a given environment. We just tried to find what we thought were appropriate properties for redevelopment. And we simply, it was a fairly simple exercise that we would love to follow up on in the future to get a little more detailed in it. But very simple in that we try to match the same population or come close to the same population as the business as usual Dr. Cog growth forecast with an alternative scenario. Of course, that business as usual forecast, I'm willing to admit, was heavily single family and sort of suburban sprawl, if you will. Of course, there's always going to be some more proliferation of mixed use and multifamily housing, but I think particularly out in the plains areas, I think we got it pretty right as far as what type of development would be out there. We were able to look even at satellite imagery and see where certain neighborhoods hadn't been built yet, but kind of platted out and gridded out. So we definitely assumed a lot of development out there. But again, no real assumptions around density. And I apologize. I don't know if that's what you were referring to.
Yeah, I was just curious. When you said land use reforms have the potential to substantially slash emissions. So it's rather than the growth happening out in the plains, put it in it's more urban infill.
Yeah, we do touch on later in the report, we touch on a number of different policies that we think policymakers should consider, you know, like minimum lot sizes, setbacks, things of that nature. Not just, you know, I guess the big topic of the day is really single family zoning, but there's a number of other kind of by default regulations that we think policymakers should address to enable more housing.
Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, well, Ryan, Ben, thank you so much for putting numbers on this issue, putting numbers on what this policy lever can do in terms of benefits for Coloradans, even going in down to the street level, for example, in the Denver area. That was super exciting to see. Next up, we'll have Martha speak. Martha, I'll share your slides. Once you see them up on the screen, let me know and I'll start advancing, okay?
Okay. Thank you. And it's nice to be here today. As I mentioned, I am helping to facilitate a coalition of groups that have been focusing on the land use reform. So it's a coalition. I use coalition with a small c. It's a network of a number of environmental groups, housing focused groups, and justice groups is kind of how I would describe this loose coalition. Starting last summer, Governor Polis started signaling that he wanted to go big on land use reform. And I think people like me got excited to see what kind of leadership he would show in a state that has traditionally been home rule with very little state involvement in land use. So I just pulled a couple of quotes from the governor. Next slide. And I think Miguel already shared one of them, but you know, he said we need more housing density. He mentioned connecting it to transit. He mentioned sprawl as some of his priorities as he looked at our housing crisis. And I will say here in Colorado, I know land use reform, you know, RMI, you've done a great job of laying it out as a climate issue. I think the big driver in Colorado is our housing crisis of, you know, depending on the reports you look, we're short between 75,000 and 200,000 housing units here in our state. So next slide. The governor also, you know, he's kind of a libertarian guy and is really into removing barriers in whatever sector he addresses. So unleashing the free market, removing barriers. So that's part of his approach to this housing, to the housing puzzle. Next slide. And he also pointed to, I think, what is one of the biggest challenges to a statewide approach is local control. And he has been raising up the issue that no one jurisdiction can solve this problem on their own, that this is a statewide issue. It's a regional issue, it's a statewide issue, and to some extent we need statewide solutions. Okay, next slide. So we put together this coalition of sorts, pulled together a bunch of groups. These groups have been meeting regularly to talk about what are our priorities. One place where there was a lot of agreement across all of the groups was on a set of principles. And I won't go through these in depth, but it really, these many partners identified what they thought were important in any land use reform that comes forward in Colorado. We are anxiously awaiting the governor's bill, which we're told will come out in the next week or two. We will actually see language. So for the members of this coalition, we're going to look at these principles and see how the governor's language aligns with these principles. And I think that will lead a lot of the groups in this network to decide if they can be at a place of supporting this legislation. Next slide. And this is my last slide. Sorry, they're really simple slides, but then we can go into conversation. And I know I see some friends in the audience here. So, once we get to discussion, feel free to chime in because, you've been key parts of this coalition, this network. So we have had subgroups of folks from this coalition sitting down to really think through what are the priorities and what's the language, what would we really want to see out of statewide legislation? And as we have developed language, we have shared it with the governor's office. Can we go back to my slide? It's okay. We've shared it with the governor's office, and I wanted to just briefly tell you about some of these issues that we have talked about. One is the need for some kind of housing needs planning. Identify from a state level and from a local level how much housing we have now, how much housing we need in different sectors, ranging from, folks that you would maybe consider middle class to our people who are unhoused, our homeless population, and what are the needs across all of those different sectors. Trying to address accessory dwelling units, make them easier to build in, granny flats, backyard houses, while also acknowledging issues, fears of displacement, concerns about second homes, Airbnb, rental market that have really had significant, and I would say, negative impacts on our housing stock in this state. We have talked a lot about middle housing, small lot zoning reform. That gets to some of the work that RMI has been doing of looking at all of the single family, zoning that's limited only to single family homes and the sprawl that's happening because of that. Transit oriented communities, what it would look like if it were made easier to build denser housing, more housing around transit, around high frequency transit. Strategic growth is kind of our shorthand for this idea of reducing sprawl, the environmental impact, the impact on water, the impact in terms of, fire danger, climate change, of sprawling development versus more infill development. And it's interesting there where we've actually found that the policy toolbox is fairly thin on that we know the benefits of it, but the actual policies that you can put into statewide legislation that really are effective at reducing sprawl without having all sorts of unintended consequences is still somewhat limited. Parking reform has been one of our conversations because, as you know, the more space you build for cars, the less space you have for houses and bedrooms. Parking's a really, really sensitive topic, and people get worked up about it, but it has been part of the conversation amongst this network of organizations. And I just want to note that woven throughout all of these conversations has been a real concern and desire to minimize displacement, because if you unleash the market, one place the market will go is to naturally affordable housing. The cheap houses that are out there that, people are currently living in. We don't want to make them the immediate target for developers, and encourage affordable housing, both subsidize what we consider like capital A affordable housing, deed restricted, subsidized affordable housing, but also can we just make it so that developers and others are able to build more housing that is not only for the high end of the market. So that is my very brief overview of what this group has been thinking about. As I said, we are anxiously awaiting the governor's bill. It's going to be a really interesting conversation in the state legislature. I think, one of the biggest concerns is going to be local control of local governments, really deeply concerned about their what might happen in their community. And I also think, we'll run into what I'll call the NIMBY force, the neighbors that don't want to see any change in their neighborhood. If all of this passes, there will be changes in some neighborhoods. And I also think there will probably be some folks on the concerned about justice and equity who feel like the language may not go far enough, may not be strong enough. So that's my very brief shorthand of what I see going on in Colorado, and realize I'm just facilitating some conversations and I just see one small piece of it. But with that, I would love to open it up to others on the call who are involved in this, who want to correct me or add to it, or, let's have a discussion.
Sure. Martha, thanks so much for framing the issue in terms of the governor's goals, what he stated, and some of the policy avenues that you see here. I do have one question from the audience that was pre-submitted, and then we'll open it up to those on the line. You can either submit your question in the chat or raise your hand, and we'll answer in the order we receive them. So as a few of you saw there, I was going to a question from a community member who asks, what strategies are truly being considered for developing deeply affordable housing that is near transportation transit without displacing current residents? The attendee continues that our community is predominantly refugees and immigrants who need reliable transportation and dignified housing, but continue to be displaced due to how expensive housing is becoming. So Martha, why don't we start with you on that one, and then Ben and Ryan, if you have anything to add, we can shift over.
Thank you. And it's a really good question, and something that we have, our coalition, our group has really struggled with. One of the ideas that, well, I will say, for one, this land use reform bill, I'll be overly simplistic, which always gets me in trouble, but basically it's looking at how to provide more housing. There are also other bills moving through the state legislature at the same time around rent control and around, I don't even know the words, but around eviction. Maybe somebody on the call is deeper on those. And I think just cause eviction, those are the words I was looking for. I think those are really complementary, and you need to be addressing the housing crisis from all of those levels. That you can't just, in my opinion, you can't just build more housing and solve all of the problems. That said, we've been talking about in transit-oriented development, where around transit, allowing significantly more development is probably the fastest way to add more housing. I think there, because you're dealing with fairly big developments, you can weave in things like right of return, that anyone who lived in that neighborhood has the right to return, maybe, first dibs on new housing that is developed there. We have been talking about an anti-displacement toolkit that local governments could be made available to local governments to really think deeply about which neighborhoods are at most risk of displacement. Where is the development, where, the lower cost housing that might be prime targets for development, how can we make sure that that's not the focus? Denver has done some really interesting work in that space. There's not a lot of easy answers. And I will say, we don't know what the governor's bill is going to say about this. I will note that he has been reaching out to affordable housing developers who know, champions of affordable housing who know this issue really well and been talking with them. So I am somewhat optimistic that the bill will at least take that into consideration.
Thanks so much,
Anyone
Martha,
else?
for that explanation.
Yeah, I invite anyone else who's deeper in this. We're a small enough group to, chime in.
Martha, thanks for a great summary. I'd just like to add the importance of preservation of existing affordable housing, because if we're losing it, probably not as fast as we're building it, but if we're losing it, that just keeps the deficit going. So preservation is pretty key.
Yes. And Kathy, as you know, it's been an interesting conversation to figure out, how do you actually write that in? How do you ensconce that in legislation?
Yeah, totally agree on that.
Yeah. I mean, there have been discussions about identifying anti-displacement zones, identifying areas that may be particularly prone to displacement. And do those come online later for zoning reform? Yeah, we'll see.
All right. So we'll go ahead and move on to the next question. And if you do have an additional question to ask, please raise your hand and drop it in the chat. But the next question that was submitted in advance, for the policy that Colorado is now considering, which state does it most resemble in terms of other states doing land use reform, and have those policies been effective in those states? I know the bill hasn't come out yet, but yeah, Ben, take a crack at it.
I was just going to say that I'm not super familiar with what that bill is going to look like. So yeah, again, we kind of took a simplistic approach with the analysis. So I mean, the states that are often mentioned are Oregon, especially there where they allowed by right development up to duplexes. There are a number of different policies in California that were recently passed that I'm less familiar with, but Martha, you might be able to speak to them. But yeah, I not super familiar with what the bill will look like.
Yeah, we don't know what the bill will look like yet. I will say we looked to Utah on the housing needs assessment, that they have done some interesting work to try to lay out what housing is needed, not just statewide, but actually getting to a granular level of community by community, because we are worried that some places are more willing and able to add more housing. But it really is a statewide responsibility. And we want to think about what's how do you make sure that every community is doing their part to add more housing. So Utah has done some interesting work. There is, I don't know details. I was just looking at Montana is actually considering some pretty interesting land use reform, including potentially around single family zoning. Middle housing. So we're seeing this bubble up in places, not just our, kind of progressive bastions of Minneapolis and Portland.
I think Maine has a policy in place too, Martha, isn't that right?
I think so. And I am not the policy expert, obviously. You need Matt Frommer from SWEEP, who's part of our core team. We're actually working on part of our coalition is working on a blog that's going to point out all these different efforts that are underway in what you might consider unlikely states. But we are seeing Colorado, where we think that we are leaders on a lot of these things, are sometimes being flanked by our other Western neighbors, which is exciting to see them moving forward.
Great. Well, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen just to help guide the conversation a little more as we wrap up today. So, as folks are adding questions in the chat or are raising their hands, I just wanted to bring everyone's attention to a survey that America Is All In is releasing. The coalition works because of attendees like yourself. And we know this issue is complicated, as some of the conversation generated has already pointed out. So we want to get a better grasp on where our members' interests are and where the policies like those that have been discussed today could most benefit Coloradans, we'll go ahead and drop this link in the chat. But if you could take a moment now before the end of the hour to fill it out, that would be incredibly helpful. We'd really appreciate it. And we'll also drop in the chat a link for the building code sign-on that Jasmine discussed at the beginning of the webinar. If your organization is interested in telling the state code board, electrify and make new homes EV ready, this is your opportunity to voice that. And again, participation from America's All-In members is really powerful in moving the conversation here. So I'll go ahead and drop those links in the chat. And if you have any other questions, please raise your hand and or put your questions into the chat. Thank you. All right, I see Jasmine put the form for the sign-on letter. I'll make sure that the form for the survey is also available. You'll get an email copy of this as well. Okay, the link to the survey is now in the chat. And thank you all for attending today and contributing to this conversation. We will follow up over email with more resources and next steps if you do want to continue to be involved in becoming land use and affordable communities discussion. Really appreciate your time today and look forward to following up with you.